Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into America's political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you, my friend, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the 12th day of October. It is a holiday for many people, Columbus Day, and for me, it is a highlight of a couple of weeks because it's been 2 weeks since we've been together here live at the Virtual Center. The first half of our hiatus was technological. We were running into some technology problems in terms of getting the program on the air. And the second one, this past week, I was out of state, out of pocket, traveling through New England and unable to do a program. The combination of those two has resulted in the fact that we were off the air for a couple of weeks, and I don't like that. I have to tell you that I am extremely grateful to be back here on the air with the Virtual Center and on the Head On Radio Network with Bob Kincaid and his folks. And I want to tell you how much this means to me, and I think I appreciate it even more when I'm away from it and not able to do it. I also want to mention at the outset that during the time that we were traveling through New England, which is about the last 12 days, actually, I developed some sort of a respiratory business, chest congestion and stuff, which first part of the so-called vacation really kind of laid me low. To the point that the third or fourth day that we were in Maine, for a couple of days, I went to the local hospital there, and the only thing I learned from the experience is if you intend to get sick, make sure you're home, because as I say, I went to a clinic, a very very small hospital in the town, and they were very very supportive and very very nice and did everything they could for me, except that obviously they were unwilling to treat me with anything serious in terms of medication. I guess the threat of malpractice overwhelms the concern about the illness of the patient. But anyway, I basically learned after that experience that I was just going to have to kind of suck it up and wait for this thing to run its course, or until I got home, whichever came first. And we got home this weekend, and lo and behold, I have an inhaler here that I do use during times when I have episodes of chest congestion. I used it one time on Saturday night, woke up Sunday morning, and for the first time in 2 weeks, my breathing was normal, my lungs were somewhat clear, and I'm feeling pretty good. I had intended to go to my own doctor, did not do it, and called Bob this morning and told him that I'd like to do a program today. And all of this background is basically my way of saying if I do find during the course of the program that I start to cough incessantly or whatever, I want you to know at the front end what it is, and I apologize, and I'll do everything I can to shield you, the listening audience, from any of this. But I am so excited to be back here on the air, back with you, that it pretty well overcomes and overwhelms everything else. I hope you have been well. We have absolutely gorgeous fall weather here. There's absolutely no question that winter is on its way. It seems like each week the temperature drops 7 or 8 degrees on average. In our area here, we are predicted to have a very, very good week weather-wise, but the temperatures are going to continually drop until by next weekend we're going to be in the upper 40s and low 50s during the day, down into the mid to low 30s at night. So I think in spite of the fact that I dread it, I'm sure a lot of people do as well, it looks like winter's going to come and we can't stop it. Again, I do invite you to participate actively in our program. If you ever felt like getting on the air and giving us a call here at the Virtual Center, this is the time to do it, because we are starting from point zero. It's been so long since we've been on the air, a full 2 weeks, that there was really nothing cooking. There was nothing underway. So your thoughts or your ideas or your concerns or your suggestions or your considerations, whatever they might be, related to the topics at hand, are fair game, and we would love to hear from you. I know that I would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, and I know before I left town, a few of you had, and I really did not get a chance to respond to those emails, and I will try to do it in the next day or two. One of them is from our friend Horst in Taiwan, who sent me a fairly lengthy email, which I received just about within an hour before we went on the air for what was to be our last time, and I didn't know that. And so consequently, I never had an opportunity to respond to the substance of that email, but I do intend to get back to it as quickly as possible. So I will do that. Again, phone number, area code 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And I do remind you that we have a Facebook page for the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Virtual Center page on Facebook. I will tell you that I haven't put anything on it for some time, so it probably has not changed. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I'm too new to Facebook to know what happens when a website, when a site or a page is pretty inactive for a period of time. But I'll surely find out over the next couple of days, because I have made up one of the decisions that I made while we were gone was that I would be much more dutiful in addressing the Facebook page and putting things on it. I did begin, I will share with you, while I was away, I did begin to put something on it because I was absolutely struck by John Boehner's decision to withdraw from his role as Speaker of the House. Not only that, but to surrender his seat in the House of Representatives as well. Like everybody else, I think I was quite surprised by that. And like everybody else, I was pretty well acceptant of the fact that Congressman McCarthy from California seemed to be the logical choice to replace him. He had indicated on more than one occasion that he was interested in the position, interested in that leadership position in the Republican Party. And then, as we know, within the past week, he also, at the 11th hour, withdrew. And so over the last several days, we have witnessed the Republican Party scurrying around trying to find somebody who will assume the role as Speaker in the House of Representatives. And of course, we're dealing with things that are relatively unprecedented in our history. Throughout our history, the party priorities have always been focused on gaining the majority in order to secure the speakership. As we know, the Speaker of the House is the leader of the party with the majority in the House of Representatives. And so the contest for control of the House, and thereby the right to appoint the Speaker, has been an objective of political parties throughout our existence, it seems. Now we have a situation where the Republicans do have a majority in the House of Representatives, but they can't seem to find anybody willing to assume the role as Speaker. As we know, Representative Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, who many of us will remember was a candidate for vice president on the in the 2012 election, has turned down the offer several times. In fact, the latest thing that I heard over the weekend was that there was building pressure within the Republican Party on Congressman Ryan to put aside his doubts and to take this role. And again, I think the real issue here, of course, is that the Republican Party, as it is currently operating within Congress, especially within the House, gives new meaning to the idea of trying to herd cats. In fact, there is, as we know, there is a conservative majority, I think, that calls itself the Patriot Caucus or something like that, of about 20 members or 30 members who are made Speaker Boehner's life miserable over the last several months, and this is the group that refuses to compromise, that refuses to take a half a loaf of anything and demand the whole loaf or nothing at all. It's theoretically euphorically take its ball and go home, so to speak, if it can't win, and so therefore it makes governing impossible in the House of Representatives, and consequently nobody who could pull the majority of the Republican Party together for purposes of governing will go anywhere near the speakership under these circumstances. It is quite interesting and quite unprecedented. It seems to me. Anyway, while I was away, I sat down one evening and was beginning to put together something about how difficult it is in an era when so many people are unemployed or underemployed, to think that a position like the Speaker of the House of Representatives is open and nobody wants it. It seems a little bit strange and a little bit ironic. I'm struck by that as well. And of course, given what we've been doing here in previous weeks at the Virtual Center, I keep thinking back to the 18th century and to the construction of the Constitution, the approval of the Constitution, and the origin of political parties within the Washington administration in the early 1790s. And I keep thinking about the gradual evolution of our very, very unique two-party political system in this country, and how out of whack what's going on in Washington now is with that framework. One of the things I thought about this in terms of our previous programs, the programs that we've done here at the Virtual Center. One of the things that, doing a little adjustment here on the computer, one of the things that that has really struck me, of course, is that in our most recent programs, where we've been looking principally at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, and the degree to which they are not connected. It seems to me we spent an awful lot of time in the few weeks prior to our going off the air for a couple of weeks at the Virtual Center. We spent an awful lot of time looking at the similarities and differences between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. One of the areas that I planned to go in, and of course we haven't had the opportunity to do so as yet, but we will now in the coming days and weeks, is the emergence of two-party politics in America as it relates to the structure of government and the ideals that the founders had in mind when the Constitution of the United States was created. And again, it gets into the whole issue of party. And one of the things, this is just a very brief overview in order to make the point. Parties were very, very negative things at the time of the Constitution. There was generally great concern about the existence of parties. And within the Washington administration especially, President Washington was very, very adamant about the danger of parties. But again, the issue to keep in mind is when these folks, when they talked about party, they were talking about what James Madison called faction. They were talking about interest groups, organized groups built around self-interest that would put their own group interests ahead of the public interest. And the whole idea of the Constitution of the United States was to make it impossible for these factions, if you will, to function and gain control of our political system. We know, of course, we learned in Federalist number 10 that James Madison's principal concern was the majority faction. And his belief, as expressed in Federalist number 10 and as, established and underwriting many of the other papers, if you will, underscoring many of the other papers, is the basic belief that the principal cause of factions throughout history has been the unequal distribution of property, the distinctions that exist between the wealthy and the poor. And if you take Madison at his word, and if you assume that indeed property is the principal source of factions, then the majority faction by definition would always be the poor. Therefore, any kind of popular government that functioned to run on the basis of majority rule would logically render itself susceptible to governance by the majority, by the poor. There's no way in the world that those with wealth and property would accept that. So Madison's whole approach in Federalist number 10 in the Constitution of the United States was to, as he said, control the violence of faction. And what that meant was to build in the kind of internal structure that would make the existence or the organization, if you will, of a majority faction impossible. And of course what Madison doesn't address, but I think we've touched on it or inferred it in previous programs, is that by definition, if factions are sown into the nature of man, if they are natural, and if your number one priority is to make sure that the majority faction is never able to organize, then by definition, the security or the stability of the system itself is dependent on the existence of minority factions. By pitting one group against the other group, by emphasizing the idea of factionalism, you create an internal situation of, as Madison says in Federalist number 51, countering ambition with ambition to the point that you make it impossible for majorities to form. I don't want to get into the whole idea of what we call divide and conquer, but Madison, in one of his papers, uses one of his private letters to Thomas Jefferson, uses this idea of divide and conquer very well, but it's something that you don't make public. And that is basically the idea that if preventing a majority faction is your number one priority, then you need to do everything you can do to encourage minority factions. And so therefore, what you are doing is emphasizing or prioritizing all of those things which make unification or unity more difficult. You are highlighting differences between people in order that the commonality of their existence as poor people, if you will never be able to take priority. So the irony of the situation is the more factions there are and the more seeming discord that there is in the system, from James Madison's perspective, the more stable it is, because the less likely it will be that you will have to deal with a majority faction. So again, going back to the issue of parties, when President Washington used the idea of parties and warned the nation against the danger of party in his farewell address in 1796, Washington was, in his mind, linking the idea of party with the idea of faction. As we know, the nature of America's two-party system as it evolved changed that reality substantially. And it seems to me the whole idea, the whole issue that we've been after here at the Virtual Center for some time is to try to be able to get our arms around exactly what and how James Madison and the others believed governance involved. One of the things that we spent quite a bit of time on was Madison's idea, as expressed in Federalist Number 10, of refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. And when you begin to put wheels on this, when you begin to speculate as to exactly what Madison meant here, what he was talking about is setting up a system of elections that ran from the most local election to national elections. And that this process of gradually escalating through elections, what you would be doing would be electing candidates or electing representatives who would be less and less likely to put local considerations ahead of national considerations. In other words, as the level of election continually increased, then the degree of localism that would exist at the most local level of elections would disappear. Obviously, if you think about this in a practical sense, if you're running for a local election, then obviously what the candidates are debating are local issues. But as the constituency is expanded, as Madison says, as the sphere is expanded or enlarged, you take in more issues and more groups. By definition, then, those elected to represent those larger constituencies have to be much more concerned with the regional issues rather than the local issues. And when you get to elections for the national level, Madison's thinking is that the representatives elected at that level would be people who would be most likely to put aside local issues and self-interest in favor of the public interest. This would be the process of refining and enlarging the public view. And so therefore, what Madison seemed to envision on the national level was a group of representatives representing large electoral districts who would come together with the national interest as its number one priority. Each representative would go there with national considerations and national concerns in mind. So what you would be doing is sitting down and deliberating with, negotiating with, breaking bread with, if you will, people whose priorities are the same as yours. People who have gone through this process and literally had self-interest and local interests extracted from their consideration to the point that they would be much more focused on national issues and much more willing to put the public interest ahead of self-interest or private interest. Madison truly believed that a representative republic like ours, a popular government like ours, could work because you would have the best people who have been able to withstand this process of elections, the best people coming together addressing major national and international problems and seeking solutions. Their number one priority, their goals, if you will, would be compromise, would be solutions, rather than differences and discord. What we see happening in Washington today, in Madison's view, would not, should not happen. Literally, the idea of shutting down government. The idea of people who are elected based on an ideological agenda which they refuse to consider any change to, which they refuse to put on the table for negotiation. Positions that basically say, it's my way or the highway. I get it all, or I will leave and I will bring all those who agree with me along. In other words, we'll shut the government down. To James Madison and to the founders, this is absolutely horrendous. This would be horrendous. The public's business is not being done. The public interest is not being addressed. Rather, the private interests of ideologically driven political people who are funded by big money are basically driving the political agenda of the nation. Under those circumstances, it seems highly logical that prominent leaders within that party, the Republican Party in this case, would be reluctant to put aside their political futures to take on the role of trying to bring that process to a positive conclusion. One of our more prominent national commentators, Kathleen Parker, made the point, talking about Paul Ryan this morning, in a column that I read about this. And her basic advice to Paul Ryan is, don't do it. Stick to your guns. Don't take this on. Because by definition, you're going to fail. This group is so adamant to have its way that you will not be able to govern effectively with them. And so consequently, whatever political dreams or political future you might have in mind for yourself will go by the wayside if you take on this challenge because you can't win. It seemed to me to be a relatively logical argument, but an incredibly negative one. It seemed, again, if you look at the founders and you look at James Madison, his whole idea was to have national issues debated upon and have an educational process where through debate people were learning from each other. All of them committed to the idea of finding the best way to serve the public interest. Of course it's idealistic, but it's incredibly profound, and it seems to me to be a goal or an objective worth pursuing. So it seems to me that we've got some real problems, in the nation going on, and I really believe that we could learn an awful lot by returning to the founders and just by looking at what the founders are about and what they were after. One of the issues that we were dealing with before our 2-week hiatus here at the Virtual Center was the issues related to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And more specifically, we were focused principally on the degree to which these two documents were consistent with each other and directly connected to each other, as opposed to the idea that the two documents were answers to an entirely different set of problems, and that to link them together too closely is a little bit of historically invalid, I guess I would say. And again, to put this into context without going back through it all again, it seems to me that in order to link the Constitution of the United States to the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence directly, then one must ignore the Articles of Confederation government that existed in the period between independence and the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There's absolutely no question that the Constitution of the United States, the calling of the convention, was designed principally to address problems in the nation, unforeseen problems in the nation, problems that were being exacerbated by the Articles of Confederation. And the thinking was that the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised, or as it ultimately turned out, the Articles were totally scrapped in favor of a new document, which becomes the Constitution of the United States. The purpose of the Constitution was to address what James Madison called the vices of the American political system under the Articles of Confederation. It was not designed principally to bring about the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, except for the fact that Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration made it clear by his use of the term self-evident truths that the philosophy of the Declaration was in essence the generally accepted point of view on some of these major issues that existed at the time. And we spent quite a bit of time on that and quite a bit of time on Jefferson and Jefferson's letters, in which he explained exactly what he intended and what he did not intend in the Declaration of Independence. So, I think we spent quite a bit of time doing that. And one of the things that I made up my mind while I was gone that I would mention here at the Virtual Center, because I think it's very significant, is this idea that we've been harping on of Jefferson's in the Declaration, the idea of unalienable rights. and the efforts of conservatives to include property as an unalienable right. We spent quite a bit of time on that particular issue. Again, as a refresher, the reason that contemporary conservatives must attribute Jefferson's Declaration of Independence to the philosophy of John Locke is because of Locke's emphasis on property as a natural right in the state of nature. The whole idea here is to send the message that man's exodus from the state of nature into organized society and man's decision in the social contract to create a government whose principal purpose was to protect man's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and what Jefferson said, the pursuit of happiness. Conservatives have been adamant in emphasizing the Lockean origins of that particular phrase. Because to Locke, property was considered a natural right in the state of nature. Contemporary conservative scholars want property continued as a natural or an unalienable right in our contemporary society. The only way that they can continue to make the case that the proper role for government is as protector and defender of man's unalienable rights is to include property in that. And what that would mean then would be that they would have the legitimate right to question or to object to efforts by government to regulate private property. If private property is unalienable, then it is not susceptible to regulation or control or management by government. Government's job under the Declaration is to protect man's unalienable rights, protect man's property, not to regulate it, not to manage it, or whatever. In other words, what this particular philosophy suggests is that if you include property within the context of Jefferson's unalienable rights, then you are in effect denying that property is alienable. And the fact of the matter is, throughout history, property has always been alienable. What does alienable mean? To the legal profession, if you will, alienable means transferable. Property is an entity, a commodity. It is a thing in existence. It can be measured. It can be evaluated. It can be assigned a value. It can be sold. It can be taxed. It can be inherited from one generation to the next. In a sense, then, where we are, excuse me for these interruptions, I'm kind of doing a little bit of choking here and I apologize. What we have here, then, is a contradiction in terms. Because in a sense, what we are confronted with is the reality that conservative scholars seem to want to eat the cake and have it too. They want property to remain unalienable so that government can't touch it. But at the same time, They live in a world in which property's alienability must be unquestioned. They are propertied interests. Property is their priority. And so therefore, all the things associated with the alienability of property become very important to these folks. The point is, it seems to me there's a blatant contradiction here within this philosophy. And we have spent quite a bit of time in the past, in past programs, looking at what Jefferson really meant by pursuit of happiness and the 18th century definition of happiness and all the rest of it. I was struck driving this week by I tuned in on the car radio to an interview with Ben Carson, the Republican candidate, for one of the Republican leading candidates for the nomination for president. And in this particular interview, I was struck by the fact that Ben Carson's view seems to be, he is out with a new book. Obviously, as we know from past history, every candidate for president seems to come out with a book as part of their campaign. Obviously, what they do is they hire ghostwriters and political science and historians and pundits to write the book for them. And of course, part of the deal is they don't get their name on the book. The book becomes the candidate's book. But anyway, Ben Carson has published recently a book, and the particular interview that I was listening to was focused principally on some of Carson's positions as explained or as identified in this particular book. One of the things that candidate Carson said in the interview was that he believed that there were three evils in America today. Three things that were particularly evil. And I don't know that any of these would surprise us. One of them is abortion. A second is ignorance. And the third is debt. Now, if you think about the generally accepted positions of Republican candidates, it's very, very obvious how these candidates would tend to congregate around the evils of abortion and the evils of debt. I mean, there's been all sorts of pressure coming from the right. The justifications for shutting down government in the past, for example, have been based on the principle that the nation's debt is running out of control and that we need to get a handle on it, and we need to balance the budget and all these other conservative mantra-like statements, if you will. But I was particularly struck by the inclusion of ignorance as one of the three evils in Ben Carson's triumvirate of evil. Because a little bit later in the program, in the interview, the topic came up of the recent carnage in the community college in Oregon, Roseburg, Oregon, and the killing of a number of students there. And Carson has gotten quite a bit of notoriety of late by suggesting that the carnage would be a lot less if some of the people within our colleges were armed. In other words, the idea of the Second Amendment. And when pushed on this in an interview, Carson made the following explanation, which I thought was particularly interesting and worthy of comment. Carson says that he is not inflexible on the issue of the Second Amendment. He is more than willing to sit down and discuss strategies and alternatives as a way to find ways to reduce the violence and carnage in our societies, as long as in the process it doesn't compromise the Second Amendment. I was driving at the time, and I almost pulled off to the side because I was struck by the power of that particular statement. I'm willing to listen to any proposal that is intended to reduce or eliminate the degree of carnage in our society, provided that in the process it doesn't compromise the Second Amendment. The implication, of course, is that the relationship between the availability of guns and the carnage is not direct. In other words, what Carson is saying is the Second Amendment, in his thinking, is unalienable. You can't compromise it. It is absolute. So his position going into any negotiation is to demand acceptance of the principle of the unalienability of the Second Amendment. Immediately I began to think of the issues we've been dealing with here related to property as an unalienable right. And now here's Ben Carson talking about the possession of arms, the right to bear arms as an unalienable right. So obviously, the only way that Carson's position can be considered logical is if you assume that the cause of the carnage is not directly related to the availability of guns. Because if you establish that connection, then you can't look for solutions or strategies without tampering with the Second Amendment. If you're going to leave the Second Amendment as sacrosanct, then you have to assume that all the other causes of carnage lie elsewhere than in the availability of guns that is protected under the Second Amendment. I ask you to go back for a moment with me to Carson's listing of the three evils in our contemporary society today, one of which is ignorance. Obviously, Carson's position on the unalienability of the Second Amendment is not valid. It is historically invalid. If the right to bear arms was to be an unalienable right, then the Second Amendment would not say anything about a well-regulated militia. The mere existence of the phrase about the well-regulated militia compromises the absolute nature of the right to bear arms. In Carson's thinking, then, the very wording of the Second Amendment is, by the creators of the Second Amendment, a violation of the sanctity and inalienability of the right to bear arms. The mere fact that you worded the amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary, comma, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The mere fact that both of those clauses are within the same statement suggests that they are connected. By definition, that means then, if they are connected, that the existence of one compromises the other, or affects the meaning of the other. What am I saying? I am saying that in its very wording, the Second Amendment contradicts the sanctity of the Second Amendment as being perpetrated or promoted by Ben Carson. Is that an example of ignorance on his part? I think it would be generous to say that. But again, he himself has identified ignorance as one of the three evils in our contemporary society today. And yet he immediately turns around and promotes a position on the Second Amendment which suggests, at best, ignorance, and at worst, the perpetration of a fraud. I think basically this is very significant, because what it suggests to me is the whole idea of what we mean in our society when we talk about an educated citizenry, when we talk about civic education or civic responsibility. The piece of James Madison that we really never got to yet here at the Virtual Center, when he was talking about refining and enlarging the public views through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom and patriotism and love of justice, etc., etc., etc. Madison believed that the public interest would become the nation's priority based on the mechanism or the process which produced its elected representatives. That what you had to have in order for the national interest or the public interest or the common good or the general welfare, whatever phrase you want to use, what you had to have was a body of representatives whose priority was the pursuit of the public interest against self-interest or private interest. But the question that we really never got to, and the question that I'd like to leave you with at the top of this first hour, I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left in this, our first hour. The question that I'd like to leave you with before we take our regular 5-minute break here at the Virtual Center and then come back for our second hour is the issue of educated citizenry. Namely, where are the people, the citizens, who will elect these, quote, patriotic Americans as their representatives? Where are they going to come from? If self-interest is sown into the nature of man, then by definition, people are going to be most likely to vote for representatives willing to promise them that if I get elected, I will deliver to you what you want. In other words, self-interest not only dominates elections at the local level from the perspective of the candidates, but self-interest clearly drives the voters. Voters are looking to elect candidates, representatives, who will fulfill their self-interest. Chances are they couldn't give two whits about the public interest or the national interest. So the question is, where is the civic education going to come from? Where are we going to develop a group of citizens, a body of citizens willing to elect the right kind of people as their representatives? In other words, where are we going to find citizens who are also willing to put self-interest aside in favor of the public interest? I would suggest to you that Madison's answer to that question is in the behavior of the elected representatives themselves. In the process that Madison envisions, where the National Council, or the Congress, if you will be comprised of elected representatives from districts throughout the nation, whose priority will always be the public interest, pursuit of the public interest. Where self-interest has been bled out of the system, so to speak, then the behavior of these people as they deliberate, as they negotiate, as they compromise, as they reach agreement on those things they can agree on, and agree amongst themselves to put aside those things which divide them, all of it in the public interest, then their behavior will serve as a model to the electorate at large. In effect, in Madison's system, and I would say principally in the system conceived originally, I believe, by David Hume, the elected representatives would become the key instruments for civic education in the Republic. The education of citizens would be an ongoing process that would constantly be brought to the fore by regular, periodic, frequent elections, where elections were conducted around the principles of the public interest, where voters were encouraged to look for those candidates who seemingly were more willing to put aside self-interest in favor of the public interest. In a sense, then, the debates that would be happening in Congress would become models for the development of civic education in the nation at large. And the result would be that as the electoral process continued to go on through election after election, what you would be seeing would be more and more well-educated, civically responsible citizens who would be looking for candidates who seemed to possess the qualities most conducive to governance in a republic. That's Madison's plan. I believe that it is a plan that needs attention, it needs clarification, it needs to be publicized, it needs to be understood. I believe this firmly. What we have to do more than anything else, it seems to me, is to find ways to take the microphone or the forum away from those who would try to convince us that what the founders wanted, what Madison and the Constitution intended, is the very narrow, restrictive, ideological position on which their political reputation is based. It is the difference between elections which are divisive and elections which promote compromise and negotiation and moderation. I think we have wandered about as far away from the intent of Madison and the founders as we could have wandered. And it's time for us to turn around and go back. We're going to take a break right now. We've just gone beyond the top of the first hour. It's, to be specific, it is 2 minutes after the hour, 2 minutes after 2 p.m. in the East. I'd like to pause and take a 5-minute break and then ask you to stay with us, and we'll be back for a full second hour here at the Virtual Center. Again, please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour here of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this beautiful Monday afternoon. It's the 12th day of October. It is Columbus Day, and of course I know many people are enjoying time off today. We have been on now for the first hour, but I want to reiterate how pleased I am to be back with you here at the Virtual Center. I did kind of qualify my return by suggesting I was having some congestion and coughing issues, and I apologize if this makes listening to the program difficult for you. I was noticing that as we went further and further into the program, I was availing myself more and more of the cough button, if you will, in order to so I apologize for that. I'll do the very best I can. Thank you. If you've been with us through our first hour and are still with us, I want to thank you so much for your faith in our program. If you are just joining us, I want to welcome you. It's been 2 weeks since we've been here live at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you so very, very much for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. I think that by the time we get through our second hour here today, I'm hoping that we will have an even greater appreciation for the importance of the Head On Radio Network and this kind of progressive voice on the air, given some of the things that are happening. I do request and solicit your input onto our program. I would love to have your reaction or your comments on some of the issues. And of course, the first hour, we were kind of just dancing over a series of issues and topics that we've touched upon in previous programs here at the Virtual Center. A little bit more disjointed than I would like most of our hours to be, and I'm hoping that I can persuade you that some of that is because of the time we've been gone, and some of it is just my own. The fact that I'm rusty. I guess maybe I can say it that way. We do invite your input. I would love to hear from you. So would our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me on some of these issues, via email, my email address is waobrien906 906@gmail.com. W.A. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, I do remind you that we do have a page on Facebook. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. And I remind you that on that, as you scroll down, you will see excerpts from a number of pieces and articles that we've put on there over the last month or month and a half, if you will, issues that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center. As I mentioned, we spent last week traveling through New England, visiting family, and I spent quite a bit of time in Maine and New Hampshire, a little bit of time in Massachusetts, and the last couple of days in Connecticut. So we kind of did New England from top to bottom, so to speak, over the last 10 days. The issue that I'd like to address, and part of it is because of the trip that I just made to New England, is on the issue of the degree to which our program addresses the question of civic responsibility. In our first hour, we were talking about ideological positions, conservatives, liberals, people who advocate this particular philosophy or that particular philosophy or whatever, and how divisive those can become. But the issue that we ended the hour with, and I think the issue of most importance, is the question of civic responsibility. The role of our elected officials in educating the citizenry at large, citizens at large, on the operation and functioning of a republic, of, if you will, popular government. At the same time, it's very, very important that as part of this civic responsibility issue, we find ways to identify those who would convince us of ideological positions that would be contrary to the public interest. That's not probably the best way to say it, but that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the quality of education that our citizens at large receive. Now, of course, we're dealing here, we can't help it, with our public education system as well as our private education systems. What we were talking about in our first hour is the educational function of our political system itself, the degree to which the behavior and activities of our elected officials serve to model the pursuit of the public interest at the upper levels of government, and how the considerations and concerns and the characteristics of representatives best suited to participate in this process become generally known and accepted to the public at large. Where does the general public receive its civic education? And, of course, what we're dealing with here is the issue of educational quality itself. I can't tell you the number of times over the last 2.5 years here at the Virtual Center that we have ventured into and then away from and then back to the issue of educational quality in an effort to try to determine specifically what we mean by an educated citizenry in this republic. When we talk about educational quality, are we talking about people who have the capability to understand issues, to weigh alternatives, to research questions of interest and need, to collect data, to evaluate data, to prioritize data, to distinguish the important data from the less important data. In other words, the ability to function as an independent, educated person within a society of educated citizens. On our trip to New England recently, I came across a document, and it is in one of the New England states, I'll tell you which one, it's Connecticut, that has totally, fully embraced the nation's push toward what we call the Common Core standards. We are broadcasting here at the Virtual Center today from the state of West Virginia. West Virginia is one of those states that is about to rescind its initial support of the Common Core standards. We have in the most recent elections, off-year elections in 2014, the state of West Virginia, for the first time in 100 years, elected a Republican majority in its House of Representatives and did not elect a Democratic majority in the state Senate. I qualified that because basically what we had was a situation where the Senate ended up to be tied between Democrats and Republicans. And one member of the Democratic, one member of the Senate Democrats switched parties to Republican, which allowed the Republicans, gave the Republicans a one-seat majority in our West Virginia State Senate. And so what that meant is that the Senate is under control of Republicans. Now, one would think that one seat, one vote, would not be that significant. It would not be unless the majority of votes of voting was lockstep voting. In other words, which elected representatives did not vote as individuals, but elected first and foremost as members of party. So the one vote majority in the state Senate is meaningful only as long as that majority is willing to stick together as a majority and to vote positions on issues as a group, as a party. And that, of course, is what we have. And we spent time talking about that in the past, about the various legislatures that have fallen under control of Republicans and under control of big money under Citizens United and all the rest of it. But my point is that the state of West Virginia made it the new Republican majority in the state legislature in the last session made it a priority to rescind the state support for Common Core. At the end of the session, it became impossible to do that. And so the alternative was to reach somewhat of a compromise, which would be that the State Board of Education was assigned the responsibility by the legislature to put together options to the Common Core and come back in a year with an alternative to the Common Core. That agenda continues in place here in the state of West Virginia. What we are reading now, and of course our legislative session doesn't go into session until January of 2016, but we are being told that one of the first items on the agenda of the Republican majority will be to rescind the state support for Common Core. I say all of this as part of the context for my ability to gain access to a document in the state of Connecticut which fully embraces the Common Core. And I wanted to spend some time here on this first program after our time off here at the Virtual Center, sharing with you the philosophy and the optimism, if you will, that is indicative of a state that embraces Common Core. So if you'll bear with me, there's parts of this that I want to share with you. This is a letter to parents. We owe it to our kids to make sure that they receive an education that prepares them to thrive in a global economy and civic life. That's why Connecticut raised the bar and issued a new instructional roadmap that will prepare our kids for college and careers. Our new roadmap, the Connecticut Core Standards, sets learning expectations for what students should learn and be able to do at each grade level so that by the time they graduate from high school, they are ready to succeed in college and the workplace. Local teachers and educators still select and develop curriculum documents and lesson plans. In other words, the statement of the assurance given parents here is that while we have adopted this plan, our teachers continue to control curriculum. We are not telling this, the way that this document is written, we are not telling our teachers what to teach or how to teach it. What we are saying is at the end of this year, in the areas of math and language arts, these are the kinds of things we expect our students to be able to do. These are the kinds of things we expect our students to know. And of course, the idea of the Common Core is that if they are commonly adopted throughout the country by a variety, by most states, then that would create or establish a rubric or a measure where we could identify, states could identify themselves and say, well, our kids are way behind in this. We better put more attention on this in order to increase performance in this area or that area. In other words, it provides an opportunity to see how your youngsters are doing at each grade level in comparison to those in other states. And, of course, potentially in other nations as well. With these new learning expectations, Connecticut needs new ways to measure student progress. And what they have done is adopt a whole new set of tests. This particular one is called the Connecticut Mastery Test for grades 3 through 8 in English language arts and math. With these new tests, students will receive new scores. Results will be different. In many cases, the scores will look lower than what many are used to seeing on the old state tests. This does not mean that students are learning less. Rather, it reflects that the bar has been set higher. States that made the transition to college and career-ready standards saw lower scores the first year, but they also saw improvements year to year after that. For example, in Kentucky, and of course that's the one we use here all the time because it borders on West Virginia. In Kentucky, the percentage of high school graduates ready for college and careers has increased from 38% to 62% in 4 years. I think that's very significant. 38% to 62% increase in 4 years. This means then that in the beginning, fewer Connecticut students may score at higher levels, but we expect that our students will rise to meet the challenges as they always do. And then this particular document gives for parents in 2 columns what your child will learn in this coming grade, in the grade into which they are currently moving. In other words, the new school year. This is what your child will learn during this year. This is what we'll be testing at the end of the year, in other words. And then there's a column here on mathematics and a column on language. I'd like to share with you some of this, and I'm going to for obvious reasons, because I'm not a mathematician. I don't want to get into the innards of math and fractions and decimals and all the rest of it. But I would like to share with you some of the ingredients listed under English language arts. So here are some of the things that the state is telling parents their children will learn. I want to present this list. There are 10 items here. I want to share these 10 items with you and then address them if we can. Number 1, identifying the purpose of a story, drama, or poem. Identifying the purpose of a story, drama, or poem. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't talk about main characters or summaries, plot summaries, or anything else. The implication here is that every poem, every drama, every story has a purpose, an intent, a goal. And one of the things that our students are expected to be able to do at the end of this year is to be able to identify that purpose from the story itself. Second, identifying the main idea of a historical, scientific, or technical text. Being able to identify the principal idea or the principal theme in a particular story. Summarizing the main topic of a text using key supporting details. Summarizing the main topic using key supporting details. That means not only targeting a particular topic, but using evidence to support it as the principal topic. In other words, what is the principal topic? And on what basis do you believe that it is the principal topic? Fourth, comparing characters, events, settings, theme, or point of view in stories and myths. Comparing characters, events, settings, themes, or points of view in stories and myths. Notice, comparing. Okay, number 5. Explaining how an author uses facts, details, and evidence to support their points. In other words, when you read a story, or when you read a particular passage from a history textbook, for example, which is what I'm most interested in, how does the author use evidence to support the particular point of view that the author is making? Remember, already you've addressed the issue of identifying the principal purpose or the principal theme. Not only have you identified the theme, but you have given evidence to explain why you believe that's the principal theme. Now your next step is to explain how the author uses data, uses his evidence or her evidence to support that particular theme or that particular point of view. All right, that's reading text. Now we get to the issue of writing. Writing on a topic using facts, details, definitions, quotations, or other information. In other words, at the end of this year, we expect students to be able to write on a topic using facts, details, definitions, quotations, or other information. In other words, we expect students to be able to write on topics which have substance, which have a basis in fact, which have meaning, which have evidence, which have support, which have documentation. What we are not talking about here is write on what you did last summer. Anything counts because it's yours. What we are saying is we want you to be able to write on a topic, and we want you to be able to use evidence to support that particular subject or that particular topic. Next, writing a story with an event sequence that unfolds naturally, using dialogue, description, and sensory details, and providing a conclusion. We want you to be able to write something that is more than one or two sentences strung together, which may or may not even be connected. We want you to be able to write a story that incorporates or includes more than one event, so that the story takes us from one event to the next event in a way which is logical, which makes sense, which has support, which the reader can get into and understand. We want this event sequence to unfold naturally. We want you to be able to use dialogue, description, and sensory details, sounds, smells, scenery, whatever helps us make the transition from one event to the other. And of course, we want the story to end with a conclusion, with a logical ending. Writing complete sentences with correct capitalization and spelling. None of the stuff with texting and tweeting with symbols and abbreviations. We want words, and we want letters that should have capital letters. Next, we want our youngsters to be able to conduct short research projects using evidence from books and other sources. We want our youngsters to not only be able to write substantive passages, pieces of information, but we want these youngsters to be able to do the research necessary to collect that information. We want them to be able to know where to go in order to get what they need. We want them to be able to evaluate information or data that they find. We want them to be able to identify a particular thing and say, this fits perfectly into what I'm looking for, this doesn't. In other words, we want students to develop research skills. The ability to collect and evaluate data and information in order to formulate and serve as evidence for the particular point of view we want. We want students to be able to participate in discussions by listening, asking questions, sharing ideas, and building on the ideas of others. A key here. Learning from others. What does that mean? It means going into discussions with what we call, for lack of a better term, an open mind. It doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion, or that you don't have a preference, or that you don't have something you believe in. It means that you go in there with an element of doubt, that you're not absolutely 100% sure that everything you know and everything you believe is absolutely true, to the point that you can't learn anything else from anybody else. The whole idea of doing research, the whole idea of going to a library or going on the internet, the whole idea of entering into a conversation or a discussion with other people, all of that is based on the premise that you are in search of truth, that you believe you're on the right track, but you want to know more. You want to know whatever there is out there that will better inform you on the particular subject or the particular topic in question. That means you've always got to remain a little bit open to new ideas, things that you hadn't thought about, perspectives that you had totally ignored or never even thought of. And what this means is that you take this new information or these new points of view, you go back to the drawing board, and you have to reformulate your overall story to incorporate these new pieces of evidence, which may have required you to change your initial theme or your initial thesis or your initial presentation. You don't go into a discussion on the assumption, I already know everything that there is to know. So therefore, these people have nothing to teach me. This library that's full of books contains nothing that I don't already have or that I need to know. That's not a mind that is open to education. That is a mind that is closed. What we are talking about here is the difference between education, between learning and knowing. The idea of the pursuit of truth is the idea that pursuing truth is a lifelong, ongoing process. That's what lifelong learning is all about. It's never complete. The story is never totally closed. Once you close the book, once you dot the last sentence and say, this is it, there's nothing more, this is the absolute gospel truth, and everybody on the face of the earth needs to agree with what I've said here. Once you reach that point, if you ever do, you have basically announced that you are no longer open to learning anything else. That everything you need to know, you already know. That nobody else has anything to tell you. Nobody else has anything to teach you. By definition, education has no place for that frame of mind. But what I would like to do with these items, think about this. identifying the purpose of a story or the purpose of a chapter. What is the purpose of this? Where is it going? What's the message that I'm supposed to get out of this? Once you identify that, then you need to be able to give reasons or to supply evidence as to why you believe that's the principal purpose. You need to be able to compare events, themes, points of view. Think about this. We've been talking forever, it seems like, here at the Virtual Center on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In order to protect these rights, governments are created amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever government oversteps, etc., 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 you know the drill, so to speak. But when we get into the Scottish philosophers and we began to look at what people in the 18th century meant when they said pursuit of happiness, what they meant by self-evident truths, it becomes clear that there are different sides to the same story. There's the interpretation of the Declaration that the textbooks have always told us is true. And then there's Jefferson's letters and things in which he explains to us what he's trying to do, what he's about in the Declaration, what he's trying to say, and what he's trying to do. One of the things that these standards want students to be able to do is compare these events, compare these themes, compare these points of view. Now, what does compare mean? It doesn't mean summarize this point of view and then summarize that point of view. It demands more than that. It says, yeah, you summarize the 2 points of view, or 3, or however many there are. You summarize the points of view in order to lay out the ways they are the same and the ways they are different. But then you are expected to be able to add to people's understanding of these issues by going back and saying, this person is correct in this area, but it's contradicted over here. In other words, you are expected to be able to bring new meaning to the comparison. I taught history in college for 50 years, just about 50 years. And in asking students to write essays and to do research projects over those 50 years, what I was asking them to do is to research a topic, to go in and find out as much as they could about the topic. But that also included finding out what other people, the so-called experts, have said about that particular topic. Who agrees with it looking this way? Who agrees with it looking that way, etc., etc. The whole idea of the whole purpose of the project is for you, the researcher, to be able to provide more information on that subject, major points of view presented about that subject, and your own informed position or opinion, excuse me, on which position or which argument seems to be the most valid. This is, I have to say, in the 50 years that I was teaching, this is the most difficult thing for students to do. It has always been, it continues to be. In institutions in which I taught, the word was out that to students, don't take his classes, he makes you write. What students were looking for with a short answer, fill in the bubble, put an X, true or false, whatever it is. This is what I've got to. This is my probably my main point of the day here on these particular standards. These are Connecticut's Common Core standards for children who are entering grade 4. My wife's granddaughter, the oldest of 3 children, is entering the 4th grade. And this is the document that she brought home. What these standards are demanding is that youngsters be exposed to these skills and these experiences and these exercises in the 3rd and 4th grade. Not college, not as high school juniors and seniors. One would expect that if youngsters were engaged in these kind of cognitive intellectual activities in the 3rd and 4th grade, the performance levels in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades would be significantly increased over time. During our break, at the top of this hour, excuse me, my wife was telling me that on her way home, she had just gotten home. She was telling me on her way home, she was listening to a program on the radio, local program. And the speaker was a parent who was bewailing the Common Core standards in West Virginia and why they ought to be abolished. And basically her position is the skills are too high. The skills are too demanding. There's too much stress on my daughter. School ought to be fun. School ought to be about being a cheerleader. And so therefore, what I am suggesting, and this pretty much confirmed where I was going to go in this second hour of our program today, the first program back in 2 weeks, I wanted to share with you the difference between perspectives in a state that has embraced the Common Core standards and that in a state that seeks to reject those standards. And the question I think we all need to ask is, what can we expect long range as a result in terms of the performance of our young people? This to me is the message. And as we've gone through program after program here over the weeks and months at the Virtual Center, we've been talking about the study of the Constitution and civic responsibility. We've been talking about the nature of the kind of, excuse me again. We've been talking about the kind of education that prepares people for citizenship in a republic. What do we mean by an educated citizenry? What do we mean in terms of the values of truly educated citizens. And here we are, we find ourselves in a society in which people are being bombarded with ideologically rigid positions from one side or the other. They are being ridiculed for not being able to make up their minds. They are being criticized for being confused. They are being attacked for claiming, well, I want to postpone this. I need to collect more evidence. I need to find out more before I make a decision. And they are being required to take a position. You're either with me or you're not. You're either with us or against us. You're in this camp or that camp. Benjamin Franklin, on the 17th of September, 1787, on the day that the Constitutional Convention closed in Philadelphia, was reputedly was asked, well, Mr. Franklin, what do we have? And his response was, a republic if we can keep it. I would suggest here at the end of our program that the issues which will determine whether we can keep it or not are issues related directly to education. If we allow ourselves to continue in the direction of a society that is ideologically divided and emotionally opinionated to the point that dialogue and conversation stops. Conversation ends. Negotiation becomes impossible. Compromise becomes non-existent. Our republic cannot survive. In order to make this happen, we must have an educated citizenry, and a citizenry with the educational and cognitive abilities necessary to function, not only as employers or employees, but as citizens in a republic, as citizens with a real responsibility to choose wisely, to know the issues, to know the candidates, and to, as much as possible, put the right people in positions to address some of our major problems. Unfortunately, we have people who are making policy in our society which runs 180-degree counter to that particular philosophical position. We unfortunately are confronted by people in this society whose continuation in office or whose continued positions of influence and power depend on a citizenry that is not well educated, a citizenry that is confused, a citizenry that really believes that there is no right and wrong, there is no truth. More important, a citizenry who believes that if there is a truth or if there is a right answer, I'm not the one to find it. What I've got to do is I've got to find the candidate or the leader with all the answers, and I've got to support them. As we bring today's program to a conclusion, we're on the eve of the first Democratic debate tomorrow evening. We have already witnessed 2 Republican debates. We have witnessed the ascendancy over the summer and late summer and early fall of Donald Trump's candidacy. it is absolutely imperative that we think seriously about what it is that is propelling that candidacy to the level of success that it has so far experienced. What are the people who are supporting Donald Trump telling us? Is the Donald Trump candidacy an example of an educated citizenry that is speaking, or is it rather an example of an educated citizenry that has chosen to remain silent and has instead surrendered the floor to narrow, shallow, self-interested, bigoted individuals? I would suggest to you that these issues are important. They are absolutely critical to the Republic and to the future of the nation. I want to thank you for being with us today on this first program back after 2 weeks. Again, I want to apologize for weaknesses in what I believe is my performance today, the frequent breaks and coughing breaks and all of that. I apologize. I just didn't want to go any further without coming on the air live. So I apologize, and I hope you'll bear with us and that you'll be back tomorrow. I remind you that tomorrow's program will begin 1/2 hour later. We will begin at 1:30 p.m. in the East. We'll have a 90-minute program on Tuesday rather than the full 120 minutes. I want to thank you. Please be safe. Keep thinking. And I hope that you'll be with us again tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, the Head On Radio Network, thank you. And we'll be back together, God willing, tomorrow. Thank you.